Namaskar, guys. A lot is known about the Indian diaspora as it is the largest globally, and we know about the expanse of Indian diaspora across the world. However, not a lot is known about the Girmitiyas. On a day when Honorable President of India, Srimati Draupadi Murmu, was conferred with the highest civilian award of Suriname, it's an apt day to understand and learn about Girmitiyas. Who were they? What were the circumstances under which they went through what they did? And eventually, what has become of them? Hello and welcome to StudyIQ IAS English. I am Bhuvan A. As in this video, first to kick off this whole discussion, we will take a look at the Girmitiyas. So our story begins in 1834. Now, the story so goes that, African slaves, they were liberated. Finally, the British had abolished slavery, and because of this, now there was a domino effect. So you see, the whole vast empire that the British had built, it was essentially built on the blood, the sweat, and the tears of these individuals. And now that slavery was abolished, there was suddenly a vacuum. So you see here, vast empire had been built on the blood, sweat, and tears of slave labor, and the abrupt halt of the supply of labor suddenly started to hurt these rich European businessmen. So they figured a way around the whole thing. What did they do? Well, they came up with a system called indentured labor. So a system of indentured servitude or indentured labor, as we know it, in which the laborer would sign a nominal contract and then get a pittance. Very low amount was offered for these contracts. However, the work was taxing, the work was hard, it was physically demanding. At times, it also affected the dignity of the individuals in how the person was treated. All of this obviously was unknown to the person when the person was signing the contract. Soon the business of indentured labor supply flourished across the empire. And who were this cheap manpower who were finally replacing the slave trade, the slave labor? Well, they were essentially Indians and Chinese. So you had people from, especially in India, from people from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh who traveled across to different countries, sailed sail and set sail across various countries, various days to go to different countries as part of indentured labor. Okay, so when we go forward, now here is an interesting tidbit for you. So we all have heard of the Permanent Settlement Act, which was enforced and started by Lord Cornwallis in the states of Bengal, Odisha and Bihar. So in 1793, as you know, Lord Cornwallis instituted the Permanent Settlement Act, and thereafter again, this had an indirect effect on this whole indentured labor migration. So what essentially happened was, as a history student, you will be able to confirm this for me, that essentially it created a new class called the zamindars just above the peasants. So this new class that was created essentially aided this whole migration of individuals. How so? Well, with their tyranny. So you see here, they instituted the hereditary zamindars who officially owned a specific amount of land, and obviously everything that was on the land belonged to the zamindar. So what was inevitable was that the zamindars misused their position, taxed the peasants heavily. At times, the entire harvest was taken away by the zamindars in the name of taxes. Eventually, it led to what could have been prevented, but eventually it led to famine in that area. Mass poverty was seen. Why eventually? Because the zamindars had essentially become the power centers in this equation. So the people of these impoverished villages, now that they were ravished by poverty under the tyranny of the zamindars and the East India Company, they were soft targets for some agents. Some agents now that, these middlemen suddenly popped up, and they were called as Arkatis. And then these Arkatis would come and sell them good stories of dreams of the future, dreams of a better life. And where did the better life lay according to these Arkatis? Across the seven seas. They sold a dream to these innocent people who were already under the boot of the zamindari system. who had no dignity, who were impoverished, and so they saw an opportunity. So when we go forward now, have a look at this. Well, this is essentially what would an Arkati would look like. So the Arkatis, what did they do? These middlemen, they targeted young men and sometimes women who were slaving away in the farms or working small jobs in the cities. They targeted the most vulnerable. Obviously, this paid off. False promises were sold, like I told you, of a better life that existed across the seven seas. That's what the Arkati said to the poor, innocent person who was already suffering. So the false promises sold of gainful employment, which would make them and their families rich if they just worked hard for 5 years. It's a question of 5 years. And all you have to do is just toil hard for 5 years, and there is it. You are financially independent in a foreign land, leading a life of dignity. This is how the Arkatis sold this whole misadventure to the innocent people of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. So once these people were convinced, well, now they were asked to sign an agreement, a contract, a binding contract. Now, obviously, you can understand straight away, literacy levels were low, a person is desperate. Obviously, not everything is going to be read in minute detail. But there's an interesting story now as to how the word Girmitiyas comes up. So most of the people who were illiterate or semi-literate, well, they had problems pronouncing the word agreement. Well, obviously, it was an English word, a foreign language. They couldn't say agreement. They would say Girmit. And thus comes the word Girmitiyas, which is where the term Girmitiyas comes up, which was used to refer to indentured laborers. So all coming from an English word that Indians couldn't say, but obviously had horrific connotations for the people of that time. So when we go forward now and look at exactly where all these individuals were transported to, well, across the seven seas, different parts of the whole world. So you had Mauritius, British Guyana, Natal, that is present-day South Africa, Trinidad and Tobago, Fiji, Jamaica, Suriname, and Reunion Islands, mostly for sugarcane cultivation and production. Mostly. However, some also went to Africa to work on the Kenya-Uganda Railroad project. Obviously, the ones who went to Africa, if they survived the harsh weather conditions and the man-eating tigers, then thankfully they were sent back home. So, who survived the punishing conditions, well, they had the opportunity to go back to India. But this opportunity was not provided to the group that went here. This was a one-way ticket that was sold to the Girmitiyas by the Arkatis. So most indentured laborers traveled without families, obviously, because they were going to look for work. The plan was that the family would come later, if at all. Eventually, right now, the focus was purely on making sure that the financial capacity was increased. So you had both men and women who were indentured laborers. Men who did the hard labor in the fields, plowing away in the fields under the harsh sun. The women were now recruited as nannies for the kids and the babies of the rich European masters. The laborer's identity cut across caste, region, and religious classes. Now this becomes an important fact for us to understand. So because what it tells us is that the effects of Permanent Settlement Act were such that eventually the whole fabric of the society was strained. There was no sort of a stable class available anymore. Everyone was impoverished. And so it didn't matter if you were from the higher class, it didn't matter if you were from the supposedly lower class, everyone was suffering. And so you had all of these people now suffering, duped by the Arkatis, and now on the way to these foreign lands. The pictures that you see behind me, that will keep coming throughout this presentation, well, a lot to do, and directly, in fact, photos of the Girmitiyas who had traveled to these different countries across the world. So now let's go forward, but before I do, once again, if you're enjoying this whole conversation, if you're enjoying this analysis, may I request you, this is my official, is it Telegram channel, and I'm happy to inform you very briefly that on the day that I have launched this, well, today is the day that I have launched this, well, we have registered an 1100% growth. So as students of different examinations, tell me, how many members do I have on my day one? And if you figure that out, let me know in the chat box and scan this and join my group. We do a lot of interactive stuff. In fact, a lot of stuff is planned, which will benefit you. And if you're anyone who enjoys current affairs, wants to stay updated, well, this would be a good call to take. All right. So coming back to the discussion around Girmitiyas, now they have been transported from India and now they are on their way to different countries across the world. So the horrors now begin. This whole horror story begins the moment they set foot on the boat. Firstly, there is no cabin class, no cruise facility that's provided to them. They are essentially herded down in the underdecks of the ships, almost like sardines in a can. No space, absolutely claustrophobic conditions, and then they set sail for places as far as Southern America, Latin America. So you see, the ships were filled beyond their capacity, and Indian laborers were into the airless underdecks of the ship. Obviously, you had diseases that straight away set in, seasickness, diseases, all of that sets in, and those who perished along the way, well, no dignity in death for them. They were just thrown overboard. Okay. Many died of dysentery, cholera and measles. Many more who just managed to reach, well, they didn't acclimatize well to the changing weather there. And so they died after having reached there. So all in all, it was a one-way journey with no certainty of making it to the destination. This was the whole dream that was sold to these innocent individuals in the name of having a better life under the tyranny of the British colonial rule. Duped by the Arkatis, they were left to fend for themselves, and most, in fact, didn't make it to the final destination. So having reached finally, if you were finally lucky enough to have reached the destination that you had set sail for, well, they were quarantined first and then assigned to an estate for 5 years. The dream that the Arkatis had sold them. Work for 5 years and you shall get financial stability in your life. Well, this dream was sold and straight away they were assigned to a particular estate. So the working conditions, now you can guess, they were subhuman. No water provided, no food provided. You are supposed to toil for excess of 18 hours. Right? Men were routinely whipped, flogged to the extent that even blood came out. Skin peeled off of certain individuals. This was the level of torture these Girmitiyas were subjected to when they had reached their destination, working in the state of a particular European individual. Women were harassed and obviously sexually abused. This was again a power game that was playing out. The white skin on the brown, the blacks. And so this was again an instrument of domination that was employed to keep the face of the population down, to keep it down under the boots. Now when you go forward, well, you can have a look. The slightest breach of contract, the 5-year contract that was signed, if you were to break it, even the slightest, the minutest bit of it, well, straight away, it was considered to be a criminal act. You would be liable to be jailed or the subsequent punishment that follows after. So the laborers would be imprisoned for leaving the estate without permission, no freedom of movement. And for those who eventually had completed their indenture, if they had completed the 5-year contract, they had to necessarily carry around a certificate to prove that they were not deserting, hitting at the very heart of the dignity of an individual. And so you had colonies like Trinidad, Natal, Fiji, Mauritius. Well, they did claim to have a protector of immigrants department. There was an institution, a body that was set up, but one that was thoroughly compromised at the hands of the planters, the plantation owners. So this would do nothing to protect the rights of the Girmitiyas. At times, in fact, turning over the Girmitiyas who would approach the protector of immigrants departments to the original planters. So you can very well guess what would happen to the Girmitiyas after this would have happened. They're in a foreign land, they have dared to raise their heads and speak up for themselves, and here is it that the person who is supposed to help them rather just turns them over to the person against whom the complaint is lodged. Right? So what happens then? Obviously, if you push a tiger back into the corner, it's eventually going to lash out at you. So eventually, firstly, there were petitions that were submitted, but then sabotage activities started. Ways to hamper the operation of the plantations were made up and executed. And then at times, well, some third degree was also given from this side. And so the severe punishments that were meted out to those who had dared to beat up the plantation owners, well, it did nothing to deter the spirit of the Girmitiyas. They had had enough by now, right? So they would often gang up and estate owners and beat them to death. So this had become a cycle of violence now. This had become something that was being traded on both sides. At times, they also pooled in contributions to create a bail fund. So those who were arrested for petty offences or for offences related to these cases, well, firstly imagine, they're anyways surviving on a pittance. They do not have a lot of money. And even then, they find something out of that money, individually as well as a group, to contribute and bail their brother or their sister out. So why is this important? Because again, when they had set sail, well, they did have probably their whole place in the social hierarchy of India. But once they reached there, it was an Indian identity that binded them. They were being treated such because they belonged to a particular area, because they were of a particular color. So workers banded together, forgetting about caste and religious divisions. No more did this exist. No more was this constraint there anymore. Everyone was free of this. And then they supported each other. Right? So you had examples of Hindus who would build mosques and Muslims who would build temples. Right? The Girmitiyas held on to their faiths with everything they had, because again, in a foreign land, against all odds, that is all a person has. Hope in this case for them was their faith. So at the end of the day, it was their unrelenting faith in God which eventually hardened them, made them resilient, and possibly is the reason why today the descendants of these individuals have contributed in a rich manner to the country that they settled in, that they are part of. Right? So let's go forward and look at this whole transition now. This transition from settling to adapting to now thriving. Right? So people who finished their tenure now, what would they do? After the 5-year contract was done, well, some would go ahead and get better contracts, better paying contracts on the back of the experience that they had. So some would get better positions, better contracts, and some, well, they saved money. The old-fashioned Indian way, saved money, bought small agricultural tracts, some cattle, and started cultivating. The old-fashioned Indian method was applied. Save money, toil hard, build a life. So, massive strikes were arranged. This obviously hampered the working conditions of these plantations. The British finally realized that they could not go along and with this arrangement any further, that this was now becoming a headache for them. Right? So, they also invested a lot in education. Again, an Indian quality, a Chinese and an Indian quality, making sure that your wards, that your children are have the accessibility to the best of education within your means. This was done by these individuals in a foreign land for their children, which is why this thrust on education now shows through when you compare, say, the generation to generation growth of the Girmitiyas. But then the counterpoint to all of this investing in each other, investing in an individual, and eventually the growth of the Indian community there, well, this paint a target on their back. This made them a target for both locals and the colonial government. They did not like it. They had other plans for the Indian population, but somehow with the resilience and the inbuilt drive that the Indian population has, well, they were beginning to not just survive, but also flourish, thrive now. And so obviously, the locals didn't like it, and the colonial government obviously was never in favor of it. So this particular bill, Immigration Law Amendment Bill in Natal and Transvaal, that is present-day South Africa. So this stated now that Indian labourers could not be free after their tenure, that after you had completed the contract, no more shall you be granted freedom. That they had to either return to India Or the second was that re-indenture themselves for 2 years. Now this was obviously a non-starter proposition because it would cost a lot of money. Here we are talking about individuals who are saving money. How would they have afforded themselves a ticket back to India? So essentially this was two choices, mirroring, basically giving them one choice and making it seem like you've given two choices. Well, one was obviously a non-starter, right? So with this having been done, you have another example, the Franchise Amendment Bill. Again, the Franchise Amendment Bill limited the number of individuals who could vote to just 300 as opposed to the 10,000 white workers. Yes, we all must be realizing this individual, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, his example of standing up for the rights of laborers who were working in South Africa. The Black Act of 1907, which required them to register their fingerprints. Yes, the Supreme Court declaring that only Christian marriages were legal, essentially hitting again at the heart of the social fabric of these individuals. You're hitting at the individual freedom. You're taking away the legitimacy of a relationship that an individual who has gotten into. Well, what gives the right to the Supreme Court to do that? But then this was being done to unfairly target this population. So you had Mahatma Gandhi, who supported and submitted petitions, wrote letters. Well, he spoke about it. The whole preliminary phase of Mahatma Gandhi's growth, when it is seen in South Africa, well, this is what he was talking about. He was talking about the rights of the indentured laborers who had gone, say, possibly 50, 60, 70 years before him. Okay. And finally, we come to this particular concept. Very important again for you to just remember these words because these will showcase your thorough understanding of the subject. So there's something called the Windrush Generation, which is essentially referring to the wave of people who migrated from the Caribbean British territories to the UK. Okay. So once you had the first generation of Girmitiyas passed, then you had the second ones who wanted to go to and settle in the United Kingdom. Many families, obviously with Indian roots, were amongst them. And then this particular act comes by the British government. They threatened the children of the Windrush generation, those who had gone between this particular time frame, that they will be deported. Okay, since they did not have official documentation, no matter that they were working, that their parents were working in a British colony, yes, that they had all the rights to a citizenship, and yet the British government said, well, we will deport you. You do not have official papers. Obviously, they had to apologize for this inhumane act. They did so in 2018 because obviously this was hitting again at the very heart of these individuals. You're hitting at the family structure. You can't break down families on some arbitrary interpretation of some old-fashioned law. Right? Again, Suriname. The positive side, now let's look at it. Suriname, where again the Honorable President has gone. She has been conferred with the highest civilian award of Suriname. So Suriname, the smallest country in South America, sizable Indian population. We have discussed about Suriname earlier today in the daily editorial analysis that we do. So the country of Suriname celebrates the 5th of June as India Arrival Day. Many other countries where the Girmitiyas did finally land, well, most of them celebrate Indian Arrival Day at some time or the other. And that is only done because of the contribution of the Girmitiyas and their subsequent generations in adding value to the society of that country, in adding value to the economy of that country, in adding value to the culture of that country. So, for example, in the Caribbean, you find a fusion dish called the doubles, which has a certain element of chola bhatura and certain other element of the local cuisine of that place. And it is enjoyed by both the Caribbean people as well as the non-Caribbean people. So this is how, the Indians have come up. Obviously, now they are citizens of the country that they belong to. But then this nice synthesis of different cultures and forming a product that everyone else enjoys and enjoys together. So this is why Indians today add value to wherever they go. And not just the Indian diaspora, but then those who are the generational children of Girmitiyas also. Right? So you have in 2015 Baba Mai, a statue of an Indian couple who represent indentured laborers was installed on the spot where the ship carrying the first batch of laborers, the Lalla Rook. Two good names to remember, the Baba Mai. Okay. The Baba Mai, this statue was installed at the place where the first ship had arrived, the place being called Lalla Rook. Yes? So let's go forward now. And finally, well, this is to do with today. In fact, just recently, Honorable President of India, Srimati Draupadi Murmu, been conferred with the highest distinction of Suriname, the Grand Order of the Chain of the Yellow Star. Honorable President saying that, well, the recognition holds tremendous significance not only for me, but also for the 1.4 billion people of India. And she dedicates this honor to successive generations of the Indian Surinamese community. Those who have built Suriname together with the other ethnic groups that form Suriname. So, well, this was about the whole concept around Girmitiyas. And before I let you go, my dear viewers, well, you must be aware that the recent CSAT that happened on the 28th of May, well, that was not a cakewalk. Okay, that was not easy by any standard, and so StudyIQ IAS has thankfully come up with a packaged solution with a scientific approach to making sure that you tackle not just reading comprehensions but also the other sections effectively. And so that will be starting the 30th of June. And so you would be recommended to join this series if you please, because again we will be going about individual sections in a scientific manner, looking at the previous year's analysis. If you would like to see, say, probably a demo class of how the reading comprehension classes would look like, well, what you could do is go to the playlist of StudyIQ IAS English, wherein I have discussed reading comprehension classes, total 19 of them in fact. So have a look. If you like the content that we have already produced, well, this course is coming up soon, and something that will empower you in your aim to tackle CSAT with ease. On that note, it's a wrap from all of us here at StudyIQ IAS English. If you did like this analysis and if you did like the whole presentation, please leave me a like and a comment, and I shall see you the next time with another such topic. On that note, it's a wrap. Thanks for watching. Good night.